Hi, I'm a second year PPE student from London School of Economics and Political Science. Well, it's kind of embarrassing as originally I just planned to create a podcast because apparently I'm far from being handsome enough to appear in front of a camera, nor am I good at making those brilliant PowerPoints that fit videos. But unfortunately, YouTube does not allow me to merely upload MP3, so I'm forced to put a picture here as my background. I know this picture seems pretty awkward initially, as anyone who's familiar with me know I'm not really a romantic person, nor am I good at any mountain sports. However, this is not just an ordinary mountain. At least according to Google, this is Mount Pelerin, which is known for its Mount Pelerin Society. I don't know whether you've heard of it, but this is actually one of the leading academic society for the right-wing scholars. It is no longer that influential today, as a series of controversial issues have undermined the legitimacy and strength of their extremely right-wing ideas recently. But this society was hugely influential back in the 1970s and 1980s when Keynesianism nearly dominated the whole Western world and eventually led to stagflation. If you don't mind me use a very subjective quotation from Milton Friedman, the scholars from the Mont Pelerin Society have turned the tides with their extensive privatization schemes, the establishment and empowerment of the independent central banks, and their very right-wing fiscal policies. Well, I'm not here to say that they necessarily turned the tides to the right direction, as their neoliberalism has caused huge controversies in a lot of countries around the world, especially in these Latin American countries. I do not really agree with their economic policies, nor do I side with them upon their depictions of a minimum state. However, the reason why I mention all these things and I choose this picture as my background is because, at least philosophically, I do identify myself as one of the leading members of the Mont Pelerin Society, which is F.A. Hayek. I really appreciate his analysis of humanity, which is based on selfishness, desires, choices, and imperfections instead of reason and results. I do view myself as a supporter of his libertarianism and individualism. So this is basically a brief introduction of who I am and where do I stand on the spectrums of social science. After this brief introduction, let me talk a little bit about the reasons why I want to create this channel. Firstly, let me be very honest. The most important reason that I'm sitting here and talking about all this stuff is simply that I want to find some extra motivation to help me match up with the energy of this ridiculously energetic city. I really wish to grasp the chance of this vacation to read some of the books that I have been interested in for a long time. For example, the books that I haven't finished during the last vacation by Milton Friedman and F.A. Hayek, the famous Das Kapital by Karl Marx, and the Cyberlinks Against the Current. At the same time, I also wish to use the vacation to prepare in advance for some of the next year's coursework. So I have John Rawls, Robert Nozick, and a lot of other important scholars on hand. But after an extremely exhausting academic year, I find it really tough for me to finish all these things alone at UG study room of 32 Lincoln's Inn. So I think that maybe by creating this channel, voicing out my opinions, and if lucky enough, receiving some comments and criticisms, I can not only gain a better understanding of this knowledge, but also receive this extra layer of motivation and fulfillment to push me forward to finish all these materials. Secondly, let me say something more hypocritic to make this channel a little bit more sublime. I find this era quite chaotic and special, especially for those who are interested in social science. It is chaotic and special not just because of the amount of problems out there in the society, but more because of the nature of these problems. If you look into them, you'll find that they cannot be simply answered and resolved by the previous models we have in social science. Although there are a lot of scholars who are trying their best to explain the phenomena such as populism, none of them have offered us a completely satisfactory or convincing answer yet. This makes our future not just empirically, but also theoretically uncertain and blurred. And this uncertainty has led to the dramatically diversified expectations of the future among the public. Some people believe the era of capitalism, democracy, and liberalism has come to an end, while others, including me, think the problem is still fundamentally similar to what John Maynard Keynes described about his era. There's a small part of the machine that goes wrong, and all we need to do is to identify it and give it a spark. But before we try to predict the future and try to judge who is right, who is wrong, I think the first thing we need to do is to come back to what we already have on hand. To those previous series that justified capitalism, democracy, and liberalism, and to track whether there is something fundamentally wrong with them today. If eventually we find out that the premises of these arguments are outdated and the logic of them are flawed, then it's more likely that the current system is doomed and we need to find an alternative to it. But if in the end we find that this argument still, to a large extent, correspond to today's reality, then it's very likely that all we need to do is to identify the problem within the existing system and try to rectify it. This leads us to the central themes of this channel, which is exactly to review these previous arguments that justified the three giants of the Western world, and to check whether there's something fundamentally wrong with them. In this part, we finally have some real PowerPoints, though they're still very basic and ugly. All right, now let me give you a brief summary of the contents of my channel. The first part of my channel will focus on the topic of democracy. I will devote most of my time to answer the question, what makes democracy the least worst? I will try to approach this question in an original way by dividing my answers into two parts. Firstly, I will talk about the liberals' justification for democracies. By liberals, I'm referring to the scholars such as John Locke, J.S. Mill, Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Constant, Alexis de Tocqueville, Isaiah Berlin, Ludwig von Mises, and F.A. Hayek. The liberals view the government as a necessary evil, fundamentally an evil. They think the government's power need to be strictly checked, otherwise we will walk towards dictatorship, or contemporarily there's a phenomenon with greater danger, that is totalitarianism. Before I come to the details in later videos, there are several interesting points of these liberal arguments that I think are worth mentioning. Firstly, any unchecked power is dangerous, no matter what the nature of the power is. It doesn't matter whether you're Plato's philosopher king or Adolf Hitler. If the power has not been checked, it will lead the world towards destruction. Maybe it is good to use an original metaphor to illustrate this point. Imagine you are in a relationship with another person. As long as you don't let your partner voice her or his opinion and speak for herself or himself, she or he will be greatly harmed by the relationship, no matter you truly love her or him or not. By the way, this is why mutual respect and equality are so important in a relationship. Well, it's kind of awkward that I frequently use this metaphor, although I haven't been in a relationship for years. Secondly, the liberal arguments are not just based on empirical evidence. They've logically proved that white unchecked power will certainly lead to totalitarianism and an extremely high level of corruption. This coherent logic makes their theory very strong, and I will elaborate on these points later. However, the liberal arguments contain huge problems. As they predominantly focus on how to constrain the power of the governments, they prefer extremely small governments with very limited authority. But it is important to remember that the society, or nowadays the capitalism and free market, also have major problems and need to be counterbalanced and regulated by the government. Here the Republican arguments enter the picture to rectify the limitations of classic liberalism. The Republicans, instead of holding a negative view of the government, view the government in a positive way. They think that the government is established to represent the will of the people. There are a lot of things that people genuinely want to achieve but are constrained by their individual weakness. The government is there to overcome these constraints and help people get closer to their aims. Thus, as long as we can ensure the government is formed by good representatives of the people, we should give the government as much power as possible to improve our own lives. By incorporating this element of representation to itself, today's democracies are justified by positively represent the people's will and provide decent public goods and social welfare to the people. Of course, the Republican arguments are way more complicated than that and also contain severe problems themselves, and I will come back to them in later videos. Therefore, have said all that, if you are a believer in democracy, which I'm not, you may actually say that a well-functioning liberal democracy, although it's very hard to find one in the real world, is justified by the most reasonable arguments of both the left wing and the right wing. But usually scholars are more modest and feel more comfortable to use the quote of Churchill: democracy is the least worst system of the world. By the way, there's an interesting corollary to this Republican argument that I want to briefly mention at this stage. Lots of scholars think that liberal democracy actually possesses stronger government power in terms of effectiveness and efficiency to meet people's demands than the authoritarian or even totalitarian governments. Although the democracy's power is strictly limited by the liberal argument, and its decision process seems to be lengthy and complicated, but when the government's action do receive people's consent, that is when it can rationally justify its actions and represent the majority or supermajority's will. Democratic government can act almost unimpededly. What the authoritarian government's actions, as it can never rationally convinces the people, its actions can never be fully backed up by the people and always face some passive resistance. For example, think about the NHS in UK. Let us suppose that it has not been nationalized yet, and Liz Truss wants nationalized today. That's a ridiculously awkward example. Huh? Of course, lots of people stand against this seemingly left-wing action. For example, the leaders of the private healthcare companies, and let's assume there are some of them in UK. The right-wing scholars such as Milton Friedman and F.A. Hayek, who fear that the government will be very inefficient and gain too much discretional power. And the rich people who fear that the quality of their healthcare service will be in decline after the nationalization. So we'll have a lengthy debate and the government need to persuade most of its opponents. However, the government actually has a lot of rational models in its pocket. Today we'll have the famous adverse selection model to show that the private companies are even more inefficient than the government in the healthcare market. Thus, the government's action can actually increase efficiency and generate more consumer welfare. At the same time, we also have the brilliant models from welfare economics, which shows that this nationalization, by reducing the inequality of the society, can lead to higher total welfare of the United Kingdom. Moreover, by providing decent healthcare to immigrants, foreign travelers, or those without a formal identity, the government can justify its actions on humanitarian grounds and further please the left-wing voters. As a result, once the persuasion process is finished, the NHS is brilliantly justified and can be backed up by most people in the UK. But this kind of rational justification can never be given by authoritarian regimes. After all this good words for democracy, I would turn to the problems with contemporary democracies. This part will focus more on political science instead of political theory. I will try to give some explanations of populism from both the economic perspective and the cultural social perspective. Afterwards, I will show which part of previous arguments for democracy has been challenged by the existing problems. But now I realize that I have spoken too much on this topic, and so I will leave the rest to later videos and move to the introduction of the next session. The second part of the channel will turn to the debate around capitalism. In the first place, I will engage with the famous debate between capitalism and socialism to show that why most people and scholars think that capitalism is the least worst economic system of the world. Well, of course, this debate has not been fully settled yet. I will start from the debate between Hayek and Marx around political theory and political science. Karl Marx has identified a series of fundamental problems of capitalism: the alienation problem, the financial crisis, the huge inequality within a capitalist society, its exploitation of the workers, the unrestrained desire of the capitalist machine. He ingeniously pointed out that private property is the root of all these problems, and thus, if all these problems can be solved, they must be solved by a socialist society with public property. However, Hayek starts from a classic liberal perspective to argue that it is impossible for humans to reconcile all the problems of the society, not just in the current era, but also in the future. He argued that humanity is fundamentally imperfect, centered on selfishness and desires. Well, one thing that I love about the Austrian school is that they redefine the meaning of selfishness. I will elaborate on it later. More importantly, Hayek thinks humans are defined by their diversity instead of homogeneity. The meaning of our lives is derived from our different choices, different ideas, and different beliefs. Thus, no one can ever develop a top-down system that fits everyone on Earth. Fairly speaking, if we just stay in the arena of political theory, Hayek's arguments, though very convincing, are not that strong to defeat Karl Marx, but Hayek, as his Nobel War speech pointed out, gained the upper hand with the help from economics. Remember that Marx's Das Kapital and all his analysis of capitalism are mainly aimed at attacking David Ricardo's classic economics. However, the subject of economics has developed a lot from Ricardo's time to Hayek's time. Karl Munger and other economists have triggered a dramatically influential marginal revolution, showing that the value of product is determined by the interaction of both demand and supply, instead of Marx's socially necessary labor time. Let me give you a brief example to illustrate the point. Think about the diamond and apple. If you follow Marx's analysis, as the socially necessary labor time to produce a diamond is not far greater than that to produce an apple, the value of both things should be quite similar. However, based on the marginal analysis, as the supply of diamonds is quite limited while the demand is very high, the value of diamonds should be way higher than that of apples. Based on these more realistic economic models, Eugen von Barwick raised this famous but also controversial challenge to Marxist economics, which I will talk about in later videos. All the previously mentioned economic models are still within the sphere of macroeconomics. But probably the most revolutionary moment in economics happened when John Maynard Keynes introduced the brand new subject of macroeconomics with his unbelievably innovative The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. The first time in human history, we possess a model to explain why there will be financial crisis. Instead of some mysterious and unexplanatory power that will eventually destroy capitalism, we find out that financial crises are actually driven by realistic problems on the demand side of the market. The market cannot self-equilibrate, and the classic economics is indeed wrong about it. However, financial crises can be moderated and even resolved by enough government intervention to boost the demand. Of course, the Keynesianism is also highly problematic, and this will lead us to the next debate between Hayek and Keynes. But essentially, just as the saying goes, we're all Keynesians today. And if you do study macro or macroeconomics and you do not find it hugely problematic, then you actually, as Paul Krugman put it, theoretically accept the logic of capitalism. Now we move towards one of the most influential and fascinating debates of the 20th century, Hayek versus Keynes. Generally speaking, wherever you live, wherever you are, whatever jobs you're doing, you inevitably engage with this debate at some stage of your life. The original debate is about pure economics, but later on their followers have extended the debate to the field of politics and philosophy. Keynes, as I've briefly mentioned before, focused more on the demand side problem and emphasized the importance of the short run. He argued for extensive government intervention as based on his brilliant mathematics, printing money can never get things wrong. He also famously raised the idea of animal spirit, pointing out that government can actually manipulate people's expectations to change the track of economy. Therefore, Keynesianism has been used to represent the top-down version of capitalism, where the government holds strong discretional power and stands in a more dominant position in comparison with the market. Today, Keynesianism also vaguely incorporates the social democratic ideas that uphold the role of the government to proactively tackle inequality and increase social welfare. Hayek completely disagrees with Keynes. His economics essentially corresponds to the classic laissez-faire economics that predominantly focus on the supply side, the macro individuals, and the role of the market. The most important element of Hayek's theory is his preference for objective rule over subjectively discretional manipulation. He thinks that the existence of a stable rule is more important than the specific contents of the rule. For example, if you go to the official website of the leading central banks of the world, i.e. the Fed or the Bank of England, you'll find on the front page that describe their role as an institution that aims at keeping the inflation rate at 2%. There are actually a lot of arguments that challenge why the target rate must be 2%. But if you think from Hayek's perspective, the rate per se doesn't matter that much. It can be 3% or 4%. Actually, any rate below 5% is essentially quite similar according to some analysis. The most important thing is that the rate is fixed and it cannot be arbitrarily changed by the government. The same applies to his support for the market over any other economic institutions. as he views the market as fundamentally impersonal and operates according to a set of fixed rules and logic. Moreover, he believes, as his right-wing predecessors, that a well-functioning market can lead to a high growth rate and benefit everyone in the economy. There's another interesting argument by the right wing, which says that if the markets are competitive enough, the Gini coefficient of the society won't be very high, around 0.3, as argued by Milton Friedman. This argument is quite reasonable, but the largest challenge to Hayek, as I have pointed out before, is how can his small government have enough power to regulate the markets and preserve their competitiveness? Actually, the right-wing policies that dominated the Western world during 1980s and 1990s have led to the rise of lots of monopolies. It is clear that the arguments of both sides contain severe controversies. Neither the era of Keynesianism nor that of neoliberalism can be described as satisfactory. These theoretical controversies have led to brand new problems in the real world. For example, the rise of inequality across the world, the dominance of the financial market and leading capitalists, a series of problems linked with globalization, i.e., the famous dilemma faced by the global taxation scheme. Nowadays, the new right wing and the new left wing, or the Chicago School and the supporters of new Keynesianism, keep debating along these lines, and both sides have raised some interesting arguments. I'll come to them in later videos. In these videos, I will also briefly address the challenges raised by the contemporary socialists to the current capitalist system. After this discussion around capitalism, I'll move towards liberalism. In the first place, I want to give a brief review of the central themes of liberalism to find out what exactly defines this influential concept. Then I will move to the discussion of different kinds of liberalism. Basically, some liberal theories, as those of Hayek and J.S. Mill, emphasize more on negative freedom, while other liberal theories contain more positive values and stress on the necessity of adequate positive freedom. I will come back to explain all these concepts in later videos. Finally, I will briefly discuss some of the contemporary alternatives to liberalism, i.e. socialism, some extreme versions of republicanism, statism, and some other versions of absolutism. I will also show that why they are fundamentally in conflict with liberalism. Besides these major topics, I will also cover some of the hot topics in politics, philosophy, and economics. For example, I may make a video for the coming election between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. And I also plan to talk a little bit about the future of the PRC if my channel has not been banned by that time. If I still have time, I will introduce some interesting theories that I've learned this year regarding the United States. That is all for this lengthy intro. Thanks for watching.